Okay, good. Okay, so chapter 10. So we just ended 9. We just ended chapter 9, if you remember, and chapter 9 ended. Well, chapter 9 was about basically the sovereignty of God. It talked about the concept of predestination and all that kind of good stuff. But it was Paul talking about basically God's response or God's responsibility in what He does. We're talking about, God. Paul was defending the sovereignty, the absolute sovereignty of God. He upheld, I guess you could say, the I was thinking and reading at the same time, and that threw me off. The perfect righteousness, that's what it was. He upheld the perfect righteousness of God in the decisions that He makes. We looked at, some examples of Moses and Pharaoh. He chooses some, he hardens some, things like that. Those are God's decisions that are made to come about to a certain aspect of His plan. Those things were not that He forced those upon us. Those are choices that we made, and He gave us over to those choices and things like that. So if you remember that, Paul is defending that, defending the righteousness of God, supporting the mercy that God has, and defending the absolute fairness that God has. Because that's a big question. That was the big question. If God's doing all this stuff, how much input, how much say do we have? And that's what he's doing. So now Paul is kind of coming to chapter 10, because chapter 9 was all about the sovereignty of God and how that unfolded. And now, and that's kind of God's thing, all right? God's sovereignty, God's thing. Now chapter 10 is almost like the other side of the coin, so to speak, because now we're going to be talking about our responsibilities in these things, all right? So we're kind of, chapter 9 and chapter 10 kind of go together a little bit, because you're able to see the other side of the coin, so to speak. We went through verse 1 through 4, and we talked about, Paul, really feeling for his people, the Israelites, you know what I mean? He still feels bad about that. He shows a little empathy towards them because he understands how people's passions and things can be a wonderful driving force, but can be a little misplaced because of the knowledge is the thing that he had. Because of the knowledge, you have a certain knowledge and you feel that's a certain driving point, but without the proper knowledge, without the proper understanding, you can actually be, driving yourself in the wrong direction. So he kind of talked about that a little bit, and now that kind of brings us to verse 5. Okay. So verse 5 is where we're going to talk, where we're starting at. Got a little quick synopsis there. And we're talking about 5. Now, once again, we've been talking about Moses, you know what I mean? Paul, when he talks about what he talks about, and he also gives an example about what he's talking about to try and drive home the point that he's making. And he uses a lot of Old Testament, Old Testament examples, things, once again, that back then, when he mentioned them, oh yeah, they'd know that. You know what I mean? Because that's stuff that they would know. We are unpacking it right now. We're kind of relearning it, I guess you could say, or realizing it in our time, because it isn't as predominant now as it was back then. You know what I mean? So he's, was talking about Moses and that whole thing. Verse 5 says, For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of the law. Let me back up to verse 4, because we're going to kind of tag in on verse 4 a little bit. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. We talked about that last night. Christ, because of Christ, who Christ is, what he's done, all that kind of stuff. It talks about him being the end of the law. We're talking about the Israelites. We're talking about the Jewish people that are so intent on holding on to that law, and we're going to talk about that verse 4 tells us that Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. We're going to talk about verse 5. For Moses writes about the righteousness which is of the law. The man who does those things shall live by them. Okay, let's talk about verse 5 real fast. Now, Paul's talking here again about the role of the law and the role of the law and the role of righteousness in our lives. All right, kind of how those two things play together. Once again, God revealed the law to the Israelite people, and the Israelite people embraced that, and they embraced it so much that they, because of the special revelation that was given to them, they kind of took a little ownership in it, which was good. That's what God intended, but they went a little bit too far. All right, and because of that, they took the law as being the absolute. Okay, they saw the law as being the ultimate standard from which they needed to live, and in some ways it was, but it was the minimum requirement. It was the minimum standard. Once again, Paul's told us in times past that the purpose of the law was to show the offense. It was to show how bad sin was. Okay? Maybe sometimes you don't understand how bad things are until someone takes it and shows it to you and explains it to you. And that was the purpose of the law. Okay? The purpose of the law was to show the offense, was to show how bad sin was. And here we see, excuse me, oh, I got this water. Could you get me this water, Mom? My mother got me water. Good mom. She's a good mom.
You need a cough drop?
No. No, I should be okay. Okay. So they view the law as a means to righteousness. Okay? And the law, who can somebody tell me the difference between the law and grace? Like, what is the fundamental difference between the law and grace?
Jesus died on the cross?
Yes.
You're talking about when did it change from...
No. The difference between the two. Christ dying on the cross for our sins gives us grace, which then eliminates the necessity of what? Of the law.
Of the works.
Works. Works is the thing. All right? So the concept is that the Israelite people have received the law. They take this law and they assume it to be a means to righteousness. Okay? So, and in theory, okay, theoretically speaking, all right, it seems like it could be possible. If you look at the law, you look at the law and you think theoretically it's possible that you could receive righteousness if you followed the letter of it. You know what I mean? And in their mind, that's kind of where they're at. In their mind, they're thinking, well, theoretically, if I did everything that the law told me to do, and I fulfilled everything that the law told me to do, and I was doing the law every day as I needed to do it, well, I could work my way to righteousness. And theoretically, it seemed like that was possible. Okay? But, is it possible? No. Practically speaking, no. Theoretically, they viewed it as possible. But practically speaking, there's no way. I mean, there's no way. I mean,
rules weren't
yeah, there's way too many rules. And once again, these rules were set out there to try and show you how bad sin was in your life. It wasn't there to give you the opportunity to impart righteousness to yourself, to work to get righteousness to yourself. It was there to show you how bad sin was, so that when the time came, you would then accept the necessity to achieve righteousness, which would be ultimately grace, Jesus Christ dying on the cross. Okay? So, practically speaking, the law is not in your favor. And it never was. And it was never intended that way. So I think that's where Paul's coming along. And he's, in verse 4, he says that Jesus is the end of the law. Okay? Why is he the end of the law? Well, that's because he's the one that he fulfilled the requirements of it, he filled the purpose of it, he did everything that needed to be done of it. He lived a perfect life, and he fulfilled everything that needed to be fulfilled, which is not something we can practically do as humans. But he did in an effort to make himself that perfect sacrifice so that he could impart to us that death and that life that he had from being resurrected. So if you look at verse 5, that's the statement, excuse me, down a little bit. That's the statement that's kind of being made here. Okay, verse 4 says, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. For Moses writes about righteousness, which is of the law." Okay? And he says, "The man who does these things shall live by them." The reason why he's doing that is he's quoting the idea that if you guys are thinking that all you got to do is just follow the law to the T and then you're fine. But you got to remember verse 4. You got to remember that Jesus is the end of the law of righteousness. Moses even talked about the law in righteousness. That if you follow it, you're committed to it, but there's no way that you're going to fulfill it. Okay? So that's what he's trying to tell there. So he starts 1 through 4 talking about how, he feels really bad for these, for the Israelites, for the Hebrew people, for all these people that are his people. He thinks about all the Pharisees and stuff that he grew up with and all these things, and he's realizing, man, you're kidding yourself right now, is what he's saying. You're kidding yourself, thinking that you can work to achieve righteousness. But even Moses himself said, Moses, the guy who got the law, is telling you about righteousness, that fulfilling it is not practically possible. So you're theoretically living this lie, but practically you need to wake up and see what needs to be done, and that's grace. Okay? Everybody got that?
They didn't understand about Jesus then. All they knew was the law, right?
Right, for 1,500 years.
Yeah.
That's all they lived, was the idea of
So
the
he's
law.
saying it now.
Yeah, so he's...
Israelites, once they knew about Jesus.
Right, and that's the beauty of it, because, we, nowadays, once again, back in the old days, he'll mention all these Old Testament, stories and things. Well, they understood that, they knew that stuff, because it was closer in time back then, and, they were students of the scriptures and stuff, they understood that stuff. Okay? We now are looking back on it, trying to relearn those things because they aren't there. And when we do these things, we have the benefit. We're reading Romans in the New Testament. New Testament didn't exist back then. Paul hadn't even written it yet. Okay? So when he talks to people, what does he do? He uses the Old Testament scriptures that these people already know to amplify his point. So that's why it's so important that he's looking back going, even Moses was talking about, this back in the day. And he's the guy that gave you the law. You know what I'm saying? So that's why it's so vital for us to understand that. Or for us to understand how impactful it was to the readers of that time, not just to us. Because to us, it's obviously impactful to us. Right now, he's talking mainly to Israel, the Israelites and stuff. But to us, it's vitally important because for those of us who try to live our lives based off of, works, even back then, it wasn't possible, Even back then, it wasn't a practicality, a practical way of life, So to kid yourself into thinking that you can pull that off now is kind of ridiculous, you know what I mean? Anyway, but that's that. Any thoughts, comments, Sherry?
Not yet.
All right, right on.
I'll let you know though.
So, verse 5 is talking a lot about man working for their salvation. Okay? In verse 6 through 7, we're going to talk about how you can't work for that salvation. Okay? So verses 6 and 7, we're going to advance on to 6 and 7. Alright? 6 and 7 says this. It says, "But the righteousness of faith speaks in this way. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is, to bring Christ down from above, or who will descend into the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead." Okay, let's stop right there. I know that's pretty clear, and you guys totally understand that, so we'll move on from there. Okay, no. All right, right on. So actually what he's doing here is he's quoting Deuteronomy 30, which we need to turn there so that we can gain a little bit of perspective. So Deuteronomy, if you have a chance here, Deuteronomy chapter 30, starting in verse 9. Okay, Deuteronomy 30. I should have marked it in my Bible so I can get there faster. Deuteronomy 30, starting in verse 9. Now, the only response to the truth of the fact that you can't work for your salvation, this is the point that he's trying to make, is that you can't work for your salvation. So the only response that human beings should have to the concept that you cannot work for your righteousness is to be submissive, to be humbly submissive to the one who can provide it. You know, it makes total sense. If you're trying to do something and you can't get it done, you need to come before the person that can get it done for you. Okay? All right? That's just the way it is. Your air conditioner breaks. You need to humbly come before somebody who can fix it. Hey man, can you fix my air conditioner? Sure, you know, they do that. You know what I'm saying? So if you've got somebody who can provide this righteousness for you, well, you need to make sure that you submit to that person. You come before that person, okay? And that's the concept here. This is the only truth that we need to understand. And the illustration that he used of getting righteousness by faith and not by the concept of working, he talks about Moses again in Deuteronomy. He likes doing Moses a lot. And I think it's ironic because he's using Moses, the guy that provided the law, and he's using Moses a lot to say why this isn't a viable option for you. So Deuteronomy 39 through 14, it says, okay, so wait a minute. So back here in chapter 10, in verse 6, it says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is, to bring Christ down from above, or who will descend to the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead. So, to gain perspective, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 9 through 14, it says, the Lord your God will make you abound in all work, abound in all the work of your hand, in the fruit of your body, in the increase of your livestock, and produce in the land for good. For the Lord will again rejoice over you for good, as he rejoiced over your fathers. If you obey the voice of the Lord, your God will keep his commandments and his statutes, which are written in the book of the law. And if you turn to the Lord, your God, with all your heart and with all your soul, okay? Then, in verse 11 it says, for this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it, nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will go over the sea for us and bring it to us, that they may hear it and do it. But the word is very near you, in your mouth. Am I going to 14? Is that what I said? Yeah, I think it's 14. But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it. Okay. This is where we get that quote from. Okay? This is where we get that quote from. And I'll tell you why it's important. The Israelites, this is kind of referring to them going into the promised land. Okay? Going into the promised land. That's the whole part of this chunk before the actual quote that we get in here. The context is that they're going to, the Israelites are about to go into the promised land. And God explained to them the great reward that they can get for their obedience. Okay? He says right there, he will make you abound in all the work of your hand, the fruit of your body, that's working. Okay? It will increase your livestock. You will produce the fruit in the produce of your land for good. You'll rejoice over the goods and rejoice over your fathers. If you obey the voice of the Lord, your God, and keep his commandments and his statutes written in the book of the law, if you turn to the Lord your God, your heart, and with all your heart and with all your soul. So he's telling you, if you're going into this promised land, you're going to work hard, there's going to be abundance there. He's telling them the wonderful benefits that can come from obedience. Okay? And then he's also reminding them, later on in the verse, that what the reality of what he's asking for is. Okay? He's not asking for perfection, okay, in this verse. And that's important. That's an important key factor. Okay? He's not asking for perfection here. Okay? In chapter 10, hopefully you got your fingers there, Romans chapter 10, okay? He's saying, but the righteousness of faith speaks this way, okay? Do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven, that is, to bring Christ down from above, or who will descend into the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead. And how that relates to the Deuteronomy 30 thing is that he's not asking you for perfection. Here in Deuteronomy, he's talking about going into the promised land. He's talking about the wonderful abundance that can come from obedience. Okay? And he's not saying, I need you to go in there. If you try and keep the law and stuff like that, you obey what I'm telling you to do, great things are going to happen. But he's not telling you to go and do these things perfectly. He's not saying if you go in and do everything perfectly, all this is going to be done. Okay? The key word that's used in the Deuteronomy passage is obedience. Okay? Obedience. Okay? He doesn't say, the Lord will God will make you abound in all the work of your hand and the fruit of your body, and in the increase of your livestock, and in the produce of the land for your good. For the Lord will again rejoice you for the goods he has rejoiced in your fathers. If you are perfect in the voice of the Lord, no, that's not what it says. It says, if you obey the voice of your Lord your God and keep his commandments and statutes that are written in the book of the law with your heart and your soul, okay, then good things are going to happen. The key word there is obey. And that's the point that Paul is making here, is this concept of obedience, of devotion. He's not asking for perfection, okay? Because his perfection, once again, this is why Paul's bringing this up, because of verse 5. Verse 4 and 5, I guess you could say, is talking about the idea that in theory you think you can be perfect. In theory you think that you're going to reach perfection enough to gain righteousness on your own. But what he's saying here is that ain't the case. Okay? He's referring to this thing back in from Moses, back in Deuteronomy 30, because even back then, God didn't say, I need perfection of you to be able to gain all these wonderful things and all the wonderful things I'm going to do for you and all that stuff. That's not what he says. What he says is, I need your obedience. I need your obedience. I need your dedication. I need your devotion. Is perfection something we can achieve? Absolutely not. But is dedication, devotion, and obedience something we can achieve? Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay? So devotion is a faithful response to what God does for us and in us and through us. Faithful, that devotion is what we can do. That is something humanity can achieve. All right? Back in those days, back in the Israelites during the time of Moses, were given access to the righteousness of God through faith. Just like today. But they didn't recognize it as that. They recognized it as they just need to do stuff. But that's not what it was about. He never said, I need perfection for you. I need you to live your life perfectly this way. He said, I need you to obey. Well, how is that different from now? It isn't. And that's Paul's point. That's Paul's point here. Is that I'm not asking you for perfection, because in theory you think you can pull it off, but practically there's no way. What we are asking for is devotion. Devotion is something we can do. Okay? And that's the concept that he's talking about. Are we expected to ascend to heaven? All right? Are we expected, this is what he's saying, are we expected to ascend to heaven to get what we need? No. What happened? Well, heaven came down and gave us everything we needed. Okay? Are you, basically what he's saying is, are you able to just do everything perfectly and be able to ascend to heaven on your own? No. That's not what it is. Christ has come down to provide for you everything that you need. And then he also says, are we able to go, are we supposed to overcome sin and death on our own by what we do? No, because Christ already did that for us. Christ came and he overcame death and he rose again on the third day so that we could have the identification of not only his death but his resurrection, and gave us a place in heaven. Who did that for us? Did we do that? Did we impart that righteousness to us, to ourselves? No. Christ did that. Okay? And as he asked, and that's where the Israelites get tripped up. And that's the point he's trying to make. And even though he's talking mostly to these Israelite people, I think it is so impactful for us today, because we get so tied up in the doing of things and not in the response of things. And what I mean by that is we get so caught up in doing things. We think we have to do this, we have to do that. We have to maintain these things or that things in some vain effort to tip the cosmic scales in our favor. You know what I mean? But the truth is, that's not what we're looking for. God has provided. He provided His Son. He provided His Spirit. He provided everything that we needed. We don't have to work to ascend to heaven. We don't have to work to overcome sin. Those things are impossible for us. He's never asked us to do that. Even back in the day, way back when, Moses' time, that's not what the point was. The point was that obedience, that devotion, that dedication. And if you do that, righteousness can be available. All right, the righteousness of God is there, but it's not about perfection. It's about obedience. It's about choosing the right path. And that's what He's trying to bring to light to these guys. All right? He's trying to make sure that the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, not by your works, not by your merit. Okay? You have to choose to obey the truths of God and be very mindful of going after God. And then, on top of that, right after that, he kind of makes 4 separate points on reinforcing this idea. So 6 and 7 is actually a very important key part, because he's, 1 through 4 was good too. 4 and 5 are kind of a really good foundational point, but 6 and 7 plays off of that and lays a foundation of, you ain't going to be able to work it out on your own type of a scenario. All you need is the dedication, the devotion, and the obedience to God. And then he makes 4 specific points through the rest of the chapter on reinforcing that concept. Okay? And we're going to talk about it. Does anybody have any questions or anything like that?
I got something
Yeah,
right here.
absolutely.
There's, in my Bible, it's got right above chapter 10, salvation by faith, not
Right.
works.
Exactly.
So that means all you have to do is just have faith in God that He will deliver you. You know, you just have to believe on Him.
Right.
You don't have to show works, but
Right.
I mean, works would help you, you know, by getting out and witnessing to other people and showing things, you know, that you do for God and stuff like that. But all you really have to have is faith.
Right.
Believe on Him.
Right. And once again, you know, I started this whole thing by telling us this is our responsibility. This is human responsibility that we're talking about here, not God's responsibility. This is human responsibility. This is the choice that we need to make to faithfully obey Him, to be determined to be committed to Him. This is our responsibility. See, once again, we're looking at the opposite side of the coin. Chapter 9 was about God and all that He's doing and all that He's providing, all that He's unfolding in His plan. Remember, we talked about the plan. We talked about the plan as being this big, huge, magnificent, you know, very detailed picture. And we, as human beings, can look at that picture, but we can only look at certain fractions of it at a time. We can look right here, we can scan through the picture, and we can look at it, and we can, you know, behold the awesomeness of it. But if we really want to look at the detail of it, we can only look at little pieces of it at a time. All right? God's not limited that way. He can see the whole picture at a time. He's the one that designed it. He's the one that drew it. He knows everything about it, and He can see the scope of it in one glance, whereas we have to focus on little parts of it, you know, to do that. So right here, he's telling, you know, this is Paul. He's trying to unfold this to these guys and try to get these guys to understand. This ain't about you, okay? This is your responsibility. You want to talk about your responsibility? Chapter 9, he said, here's what God's doing for you. He's doing all this stuff for you, and you're thinking that, well, gee whiz, if He's doing all this stuff, what's my, you know, what do I have to do? Well, chapter 10, here's your responsibility. Since the beginning of time, all God's ever asked for us was 2 things. That's it. Since all the way back to Adam and Eve, and you can go through Adam and Eve, and you can walk through every administration or dispensation that we have. You can look through everything that He's ever done. There's only 2 things He's ever asked of us: faith and obedience. It. And that's what Paul's trying to reinforce here, is that concept. So he's doing that by now. He's getting into a section where he has like this 4-fold defense of our human responsibility, what our part is. Okay? Which we're going to start right now, unless there's anything else. Sherry? Okay. Okay, right on. All right. Chapter 10 And keep your finger in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 8 through 10. This is the first of Paul's defense for our human responsibility, and that's that the gospel is available. So because it's available, everybody's responsible. Okay, this is his first argument for human responsibility, is that the gospel is available, which makes those who hear it accountable. Okay, now let's read 8 through 10. Let me get to that part right here. 8 through 10. I told you that ahead of time so that you can think about that while we're reading 8 through 10. But what does it say? Excuse me. Let me back up. Verse 6, it says, "But the righteousness of faith speaks this way." Okay, verse 5 was Moses writes about the righteousness of the law. Okay, that's one side. Verse 6 says, "But the righteousness of faith speaks this way. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend to heaven? Can you go up there and do what you need to do?" No, that's Christ that brings it down from above. Or verse 7, "Who will descend into the abyss?" No, you can't do that either, because it says that is to bring Christ up from the dead. He did all that stuff for you. That's what he's saying here. Christ did that stuff for you. You don't have to do that stuff. Christ took care of it. Now we're getting to verse 8. "But what does it say? The Lord is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is to say, the word of faith which we preach. That if you confess with your mouth that the Lord Jesus, and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with your heart one believes unto righteousness, and with your mouth confession is made unto salvation." Okay, let's stop right there. There's a lot to chew on right there. I could get really in depth in this. We're not going to go there. But I will talk about where the context of why he's saying this in the context of this chapter. Okay? The gospel is available, therefore he who hears it is accountable. Now, once again, Paul's quoting Deuteronomy again, and the Lord, it's kind of ironic because the Lord's putting a choice before us, and he put a choice before Israel back in the day. If you look at Deuteronomy again, you're going to see that Paul talked about his covenant people. He's talking about them going into the promised land and all this kind of stuff. He talks about how such good things can happen. He's talking about how life will be good, how life will be great. He's talking about how these wonderful things. But if you don't, there's going to be death, there's going to be evil, there's going to be bad stuff. And he challenges them to choose. Okay? And the choice of obedience brings blessing. And the choice of disobedience brings cursing. Okay? Deuteronomy 30, verse 15 through 20 says this. Okay? We just read a smaller portion of that. Here's another smaller portion. "See that I've set before you today life and good, death and evil." Okay, this is the choice. Okay? "In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land in which you go to possess." Once again, this is the choice to go into the promised land and stuff like that. All right? Now, verse 17. But if your heart turns away so that you do not hear, and you draw away and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to go into and possess. I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessings and cursings. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. Let me read this. That you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, that you may cling to him, for he is your life and your length of and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land of the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to give to them. Okay, let's stop right there because we ran out of chapter there. Okay, he's bringing them a choice. Obey, not obey. That's what he's talking about here. Did anywhere in that passage did he say you need to follow the law to a T and everything's going to turn out right? No. He talks about faith and obedience right there. That's all he talks about is faith and obedience. Okay? And he's bringing a choice. You got obedience, brings good stuff. Disobedience, bad stuff. I mean, that's the way it is. All right? More than 2,000 years later, Jesus confronts the land of Israel again, and he confronts us again here with the same concept, grace or guilt. That's what you got. There's just two sides. There's obedience or disobedience. That's all it's there for. Okay? Oh, yeah. And it's ironic, again, that the message of the cross, the gospel that we know, is this same type of choice. Okay? Is the same type of choice that comes along. Paul's imparting this choice to them again. God said, when you're going into the land, if you obey me, have faith in me, obey me, think great things are going to happen. If you choose to go your own way, bad things are going to happen. Okay? And the same message of the gospel is now bringing, the message of grace and the gospel is being brought to them again. Believe, and you'll be saved. That's what it says. And right there. It says, if you believe unto the Lord, verse 9, if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God will raise him from the dead, you will be saved. That's your choice. Okay? So you believe or you don't believe. Okay? You obey or you don't obey. Okay? Now some people have an issue with that. Back then they have an issue with it. Today they have an issue with it. Because it sounds what?
Too easy.
Too easy. It sounds way too easy. People have an issue with that. Nah, it can't be that easy. Okay? There's no way that that's too easy. And, there's got to be some catch. There's got to be some kind of hook. You know what I mean? There's got to be some kind of issue. It just can't be that easy. I can't just have faith. I can't just believe and everything's going to be cool. It can't work that way. Now, once again, think of the mind of the people that are reading this. For 1,500 years, they lived with the law. And now all of a sudden you're telling me that all I have to do is have faith and obey God and everything's going to be great? It's kind of a hard pill to swallow, For us today, it's still a hard pill to swallow. We don't have the same kind of history that Paul was dealing with back then, but we're still dealing with a cynical people. The best things in life are free. No. People tell you no, that ain't happening. You got to work for everything you got. You have to fight hard for everything you have. You have to make sure that you're, nose to the grindstone. Everything's got to be, go, go, go. You know what I mean? So they think, man, it's just too easy. It's way too easy. But was it easy for Christ to pay for our salvation with his death? No, that wasn't easy. Was it easy for the apostles to go out into the world and preach the gospel to people to the point where they were killed for it? No, that's not easy. Was it easy for the thousands of martyrs over time that have gone out and preached the gospel in places and lands where they, were hostile, where there's hostility and things towards them?
Even now.
Even now.
That's right. Even now,
All the martyrs.
People are
just
literally
kidding.
going out there and dying for their faith. Is that easy? It's not easy. Okay? It's not easy. It's not easy for men and women to sacrifice control. Because all he's asking for is faith and obedience. Faith and obedience doesn't come right out and say it, but it's implied that faith and obedience means that you have to relinquish control. People find that part hard. It's not that, wow, that's if somebody told you that all you had to do was something very simple and accept something that was this wonderful gift that was given to you, and it was so simple that it could literally change the course of your life and have you live forever in a wonderful place, you would think, man, that is so great. That is so awesome. Everybody looks for that. Everybody looks for the silver lining. Everybody looks for the wonderful payday. Everybody wants to buy that lottery ticket and win the big jackpot, and all of a sudden, instantly, everything's good for you. Yes, Mom.
Well, I think that's a good example of where Satan comes in.
Yeah.
faith and obedience. He's right in the middle there. He doesn't want us to.
Right. Exactly. And that's the key, because that's where the cynic in us grows, is from Satan. There's no way it can be that easy. Everybody wants that. Everybody wants it to be that easy. But once it is displayed to you that easily, you're like, nah, there's got to be some catch to it, because I'm going to have to do something personally. That's the key. That's the underlying thing that people don't talk about, is that, I want it to be that simple, but if it's that simple, well, I'm going to have to pay a cost for it somehow. I'm going to have to be personally invested in it somehow. Well, duh, yeah. Yeah, you are. Without a doubt, you are. Because he's asking you to do the same thing now that he's always asked you. He's saying, I'm giving you this wonderful free gift of salvation and a wonderful free gift of provision. I'm giving you this wonderful gift of guidance and direction in this life that everybody wants. Everybody, you ask anybody, that's what they want. They want it so bad. But they can't believe that it's that easy. Because if it's that easy, well, there's got to be a cost. There's got to be a catch. Well, there kind of is. Faith and obedience, that's all he's asking. And if you give up your control and you are faithfully pursuing him and you're obediently pursuing him, your life actually will change into what you've always wanted in the first place. But people don't want that. They don't, I want my cake, I want to eat it too. And that's what the Israelites were doing back then. They believed that if they just did all the stuff that they need to do, they'd be able to be fine. Well, now Paul's telling them, you know what, all that devotion and all those things that you're doing and all that zealousness that he talked about in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 10, all that passion that you have is because it's misplaced. You're doing it, you're doing great, you have this wonderful passion and this zeal and this drive, but it's misplaced. Why? Because you don't have the proper knowledge. I'm trying to tell you what that knowledge is. Since the beginning, since when the law came to us, we were told that faith and obedience was the key. And now I'm telling you the same thing. And you're telling me that it's too easy. Because it's that control thing. You don't want to relinquish that control. That's what we're talking about here. I told you this, the opening statement, the first defense was that the gospel is available, so therefore if you hear it, you're accountable. And that's the key. If that's there and it's there and you know it to be true, I don't care what you think about it. I don't care if you think it's too easy. If you've heard it, you're accountable to it. And now you got to make that choice. And that's what he's telling them. This is this first point. This is just the first point of 4 that he backs up the human responsibility to God's working in our lives. Is that we have this accountability now. If we know it's there, we're accountable to it. Okay? It's a free gift. It's right there. No restrictions. No nothing. You just gotta have faith in it. You gotta obey it. Availability promotes responsibility and accountability. Any thoughts, questions on that? That's just the first. Oh, Sherry, I've been waiting.
Don't you think when Paul comes with all of this new stuff, that they're thinking, well, who in the world do you think you are? I mean, how could someone like Paul come and start telling them something different? I mean, it had to be,
And they're supposed to believe
and they're
it.
supposed to believe it. Here comes this guy. I mean, and for 1,500 years, like you said,
Right.
that's all they knew was the law
Right.
and, trying to work. So, I guess,
Well, I'll tell you. Go ahead. The
I'm
driving point of the whole thing is the whole driving point of the whole thing was verse 4. What does verse 4 say?
that Christ is the end of it.
Right there. All they ever wanted was that. All they ever wanted was their Messiah. All they ever wanted
That's
was
true.
somebody to take over. All they
Yeah.
wanted was someone to save them.
Oh,
That's all they ever
yeah.
wanted.
They were waiting. That's
Okay.
what they're waiting on.
Yeah, they were waiting on this. All they ever wanted was someone to save them. Okay? That was their whole existence right there.
But the thing about it though, they can do all the works they want to do and do good and everything, but until they confess that Jesus Christ is Lord and He died on the cross to save you, then they won't be saved. Is that correct?
Well, it says if you believe in your heart
Right.
and confess with your mouth that faith and obedience,
That's right.
then then you'll be saved, because that's a relinquish. That's to
But I mean,
relinquish
you have to
your
do
part.
that first. You know, like I was saying, and like you said, all the works you do, you know, good or bad or whatever. If you think you're doing good, you're not going to be saved. You have to confess first that you're a sinner, and that believe on God in your heart and have faith that He will save you.
So yeah, so you're talking about verses 1 through 4. Verses 1 through 4 is talking about how these guys are super zealous for doing stuff.
Right.
That's their belief. Paul was there too. That's how Paul sympathizes with him, because Paul was there too. When he was Saul, he was the driving force, man.
That's right.
I mean,
whenever
Acts
he was
9,
Saul.
Acts 9, 1 through 9 talks about how he was on the road to Damascus. It starts off, verse 1 of chapter 9 of Acts, starts off saying how Paul, or Saul at the time, was spitting out, thoughts of murder
Right.
and persecution, and he wanted to go into Damascus. He wanted to go to another place and take all those people that were of the gospel. He really felt that he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. That was his drive. He had the passion, he had the zeal, he had the drive. He thought that he was doing what he was doing. But here it's telling you, you need to confess that ain't it. That's not what it's about. You doing isn't going to help. You gotta believe in your heart that Jesus, you don't have to ascend to heaven. Christ came down for you. You don't have to go to hell to overcome sin, because Christ overcame death. You don't have to do those things Christ did do. You got to believe that in your heart. You got to confess that what I'm doing ain't working, and then things will change for you. So absolutely, that is the process in which you need to do that, because it's a switch. Paul is, to answer your question, and hopefully to expound on what you're saying. To us, we're looking at this going, man, oh man, he's got some nerve rolling into town, telling us,
Well, yeah.
But you also remember, you got to think of the mind of the people back then, okay? Yeah, they've been doing the same thing for 1,500 years. But Paul is not going in there and giving them a new message. He's taking the words that they've studied, the law that they've studied for so long, all the prophetic stuff that's come along, all the different scriptures and things, he's taking all that stuff and he's pulling these things out and he's showing them, look, all the stuff you ever wanted is right here, and Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. See, he'd go into these synagogues and he'd start talking to these people and he'd start telling them, look at, you remember this passage that you remember? You remember what the prophet said here? You remember what Isaiah said here? You remember what these, see how that all ties in? And people go, oh, like I didn't put it together. Some people were mad about it and, run them out of town because they didn't want to believe it. Well, no, you can't tell me that. You know what I mean? You can't tell me that what I'm doing is not going to help. I know what I'm doing is helping. They'd run them out of town. But there are other people that would go, oh, you know what? I guess I didn't piece it together, but I guess you're right. So yes, there are some that went, you're crazy. And there are other people that went, oh yeah, I guess that's right.
So how far, when Paul comes on the scene here, how long has it been since Jesus died? Were some of these people still around? Probably?
Since Jesus died?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
The apostles.
Yeah. Yeah. When Romans...
So they knew that some of them probably maybe even saw Jesus die on the cross.
Right.
Oh yeah, maybe. Yeah.
So knowing that was...
See, and that's the key, is that these events and the things he's talking about, understand that the law was given like 1,500 years ago. Like 1,500 years ago. But a lot of the events that happened with Jesus, that was still relatively fresh.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So that's why he's coming to them saying, the fulfillment of the law, all this stuff. Remember what happened here with Moses? Remember what happened here? Remember what Isaiah said here? Remember these things? Remember all that stuff? Well, here you go. Christ is the fulfillment of the law, and people are going, oh, okay. And and you once you hear that, you have a couple of responses. Your first response is you could feel dumb and feel kind of feel kind of embarrassed, so you retreat into yourself like, no, that can't be true because I would have figured it out. You can say, oh yeah, that makes sense, or you can just be dead set against it. You know what I mean? Unfortunately, 2 out of the 3 options does not involve faith and obedience. And unfortunately, human nature, people would rather retreat back into themselves or just deny what's going on because they think that they're right. But here, Paul is trying to make this thing completely clear to you. Completely clear to them. And once again, he's kind of talking, this part here, he's making this point for everyone. But he is kind of talking to the Israelite people because they would know these events a little bit better than, say, the Gentiles, of the time. Okay? Does that make sense? Any other questions? Thoughts? Comments? Sherry?
I'll save it for next time.
Oh, good. So we'll have something for next time. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Let's go to learn prayer, and we'll be done. We'll start next time with chapter 10, verse 11 through 15, which is another defense of the human responsibility of the gospel of grace, not works, and that the gospel is universal and it is not exempt, that nobody's exempt, which is another point that we need to make for people, because sometimes people, we just came off of chapter 9 where people were saying, well, if there's such thing as an elect and there's such thing as God choosing these people and that people, then well, not only did Paul defend it in chapter 9, but he's also bringing our responsibility to it in chapter 10, and that'll be 11 through 15, which we'll go over that. Okay? All right, let's pray and we'll be done. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this chance for us to look at the scriptures and kind of dig in a little bit deeper and understand what Paul was talking about here. Back in those days, they kind of understood some of these stories and some of these things. We're rediscovering them today, but as we do rediscover them, we see the magnitude of what was being done. Paul is making sure that we understand, whether we are Jew or Gentile, that there is still a choice. And that choice is obedience, faith and obedience versus selfishness and disobedience. And one is a road to wonderful life, wonderful blessings, and one of them is a life of destruction. Dear Lord, that choice is still being placed before us every single day. Dear Lord, help us to continue in our faith and obedience to you, and try to overcome the need to be in control. Dear Lord, sometimes that's hard, that's not within our nature a lot of the times, but you're calling for us to allow you to guide and direct us. You can see the big picture better and more abundantly than we can. So it just makes perfect sense to humbly come before the one that can provide the truth for us, rather than trying to seek truth on our own. Our truth has always, throughout time, been unreliable. Yours is absolute. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this time that we can be here together looking at these scriptures. Help it to stir us to the very core, and help us to be able to share it with somebody else. We ask these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Right on, baby. Is that your Bible?
No, I got it over here.